Welcome back. In this lecture, we're going to discuss how to actually submit a form, as well as how to add labels to our form input elements. Now, there are two main methods for submitting the form information. One method is the get method, and another method is the post method. When you're working with HTML forms, the get method is going to request a representation of the specified resource, that is, the information you provided in the form. With our simple HTML forms, when we actually use the method get, what we'll see is that we're going to send back the information to our action URL. And that will make more sense when we actually see it in practice in just a little bit. The other method you could provide is the post method. And the post method will submit the data to be processed. And we'll be using the post method once we actually learn how to connect a database with Flask to the form. For right now, we're just going to supply an action URL for a redirect after submitting the form. The last thing we'll cover in this lecture is that right now our forms are just currently empty boxes, and there's no real way of knowing which one is for the email and which one's for the password. So we're going to discuss how to add basic labels to the forms themselves. That way you can have a little bit more organization. Alright, let's jump over to the text editor and get started. Alright, here I have my basic form back at my basic.html. I have my open form tag and my close form tag. Let's add two inputs, one for an email and one for a password. So a input type is email, and then the next input type will be password. And right now they have no name and no value. We'll add those in just a second. If I refresh my page, I should see two boxes, one for the email and then one for the password. However, I can't really tell which is which, so it'd be nice if I could add a label. The way we do this is with the use of a label tag. I'll create a label tag, and notice the label tag has a for attribute. And what you're going to do is connect this to an ID attribute for the input. So we'll say this label is for my email tag. And then what I will do is inside of my input, I'll set an ID attribute equal to the same string, email tag. And this string is basically an arbitrary choice. It can say whatever you want as long as the for attribute in your label matches up with the ID attribute for your input. And then in between this open label and this closed label tag, you just type out whatever the label should be. So I will say email. We'll save this, refresh, and now you should see a label right in front of that email. So let's do the same thing for the password. We'll say label, we'll say for, I'll just make up a string, pass tag, and then set an ID equal to that same string, pass tag. And then we'll say password, colon, save, refresh, and now I get some nice labels connected to their respective input boxes. So I can tell that this will be email and this one should be password. And I can zoom in a little more so you guys can see this more clearly. Here's just the email, here's the password. Keep in mind, if you zoom in too much, you'll start getting some formatting errors. And what you can always do is add a break element. So that's BR, and that will automatically induce a break in between whatever elements there are on the page there. So if I refresh this, now I get email, break, and then password. Okay, so I have my email labeled as well as my password label. What I want to do now is add a submit button and also add an action and a method for my form itself. So here at the bottom, I'm going to say input type is submit, and I'll give it a value of submit. I'll save this, refresh, and now I see this nice submit button here. And then what I want to do is actually have some sort of action that's going to occur upon submitting the form. So to do that, I'm going to add in an action attribute, and this is essentially a redirect. It just asks, when you hit submit on that form, what next page should I go to? And typically, this action is going to point to another HTML file on your own server. But for right now, since we're dealing with just a basic single HTML file, let's go ahead and redirect to, for instance, Google. I'll say http:// www.google.com. And then I will say method is equal to get. And I'll zoom in just a little bit so we can see everything inside the form. So now I'm saying, okay, once you hit the submit button, go ahead and go to Google and get the information that's inside of this form. But right now, this email information and this password information doesn't actually contain a name or value. So let's provide those. I'm going to say that the name is user email and that the value, we can just say something like email here. So notice what happens when I save these changes and update it. The value will automatically show up as a value inside of the email. So typically what's going to happen is this value is going to get replaced by whatever your actual user provides. So instead of saying email here, they'll delete that and then say something like my email at gmail.com. So value will just act as some sort of value for it to start off with. Name, user email, is a name that's going to be associated with this email that's passed back. Let's do the same for password. So for password, what we're going to do is just set the name equal to password. And again, you can set these names to whatever you want. And if you want, you can set a value, but instead what you can also do is set a placeholder. So a placeholder is probably more common than setting a predetermined value. So we'll say placeholder is equal to password, hit save, and you refresh. What notice with a actual placeholder is you get this sort of faint text here, and once you click on it, it basically goes away. So that's usually more useful than providing some predetermined value. So let's replace the predetermined value for email with a placeholder as well. We'll save this, refresh the page, and now I see a nice email here, but the moment I click on it and start typing, I get to provide my own value. Okay, so it looks like we have everything set up for what we need. We have an email that's labeled. Remember, that's connection between this for and ID, as well as setting the form action and the method. So let's provide, after we save this and refresh, an email. So I will say jose@jose.com just to make it very obvious that it's my email. That's not my real email. And then password, we'll just put in some password. So I will put password. And then notice what's going to happen when I hit submit. If I actually expand this and zoom in a bit, you'll notice that I was able to successfully pass in not just the name, but its corresponding value. So now I see here that user email is equal to Jose, and then there's basically a placeholder for the @ symbol. Since I can't really directly pass that in, I pass it in as $40. So at jose.com, and then I say and then we just have these name value pairs. So password is equal to, and in this case, since we're just using the get method, it actually literally passes back the password provided. Later on, we'll discuss much better validation methods for this, as well as better security methods. But that's essentially the main idea. I'm just going to provide these name value pairs back to either the next HTML page or back to my server when I learn how to operate this with Flask and Python. Okay, so that's really the basics of everything we covered here. Again, let's come back to our text editor and explore this a little further. We'll come back here in my browser, expand this text editor. All we're doing is we're saying, give me an action page. So that's the redirect page. Again, typically it's going to be an HTML file. It's living on your own server. And then you'll describe a method. Right now, we'll do the simpler one, get. Later on, we'll change this to post. And then we added labels in order to understand what each text box was referring to. And then we have these name value pairs. So we have a name, and then we'll have a corresponding value that the user will provide. And we can either set a default value, or we can set a placeholder. So the placeholder shows up as that gray text that we have here, that if we delete this, we then get to see. And then you have a submission, and that will pass in and perform the redirect action. Okay, that's the very basics of actually submitting a form and adding labels to a form. If you have any questions, feel free to post to the Q&A forums. We'll see you at the next lecture.